honoring the Chief Justice of the United States and his visit to the Jackson Center. Mr. Chief Justice, I know that you have now had the opportunity to tour the Jackson Center and to see the Jackson Center and, of course, to see the city of Jamestown. But I would like to say at this point in time that as the Jackson Center has a wonderful facility, and a facility that, although Robert H. Jackson did not live in the mansion at the front of this facility, Robert H. Jackson was not a stranger to this facility as a member of the Masons and the Scottish Rite. He did indeed visit this facility many, many times. And so we are honored to have a facility that does have a connection to Robert H. Jackson. But I would also like to say that the facility is not the Robert H. Jackson Center. Although we are here at the facility, the center is much, much more, because the Robert H. Jackson, along with this facility, is about our programming and the things that we do and the ways that we seek to advance the legacy of Robert H. Jackson. Whether it's from our education initiative that we have, where we are working very, very hard to get Robert H. Jackson and everything about Robert H. Jackson into the curriculums of the schools, starting in Western New York and moving out beyond, whether it's about our involvement with the international criminal tribunals and bringing the prosecutors together once a year in a program that is a very, very popular program and one of the few times a year, if not the only time a year, that you bring together all of the prosecutors at the international tribunals. So again, although we have a wonderful, wonderful center and a facility that truly we hope showcases the life of Robert H. Jackson, the center is about our programming and the things that we do to try and advance his legacy. So again, we certainly welcome you. And at this time, I would like to call forward Chaplain Maureen Ravigno to give our invocation.
Good afternoon, dear friends. Let us now be in a spirit of prayer together as we continue with this wonderful day. Creator God, you are here. We cannot be where you are not, and for this reality we are grateful. Creator God, your lovely Son has been made to shine on our gathering this morning that honors our native sons. And for this, we are exceedingly grateful because in this blessing, almost 2,000 students were able to gather here today to learn about the legacy of Justice Robert H. Jackson and to honor the presence of another son of our Western New York region, Chief Justice John Roberts. Giver of blessings, you have gifted us with an abundance of milestones to celebrate. The teaching presence of this venerable center, which bears Justice Jackson's name and honors his life and history-making work, and today's history-making visit of Chief Justice Roberts, who comes to touch the lives of students as well as lifelong learners, to inspire us all to embrace the ennobling legacy of justice, which we honor herewith today and always. Author of Justice and renderer of mercy, the work of Robert H. Jackson on the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as on the world stage at Nuremberg, and continued in connected lineage by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and now embodied in the life and work of Chief Justice Roberts, who honors us on this occasion. This connected work, all in service to the promotion of peace in our world and in our country, all for the goal of honoring the rule of law that creates the conditions under which humanity not merely abides, but truly thrives. For these servants of the good, we offer our deepest thanks and recognition and blessing. With grateful hearts, we also, in wisdom, send forth our fervent call to all the powers of the holy to continue to guide the work of this prodigious and inspired center, dedicated to the good by its founders and current guardians, and to continue to bless Chief Justice Roberts and his colleagues on the Supreme Court as they serve the well-being of our nation in the name of justice and judicial fortitude. In Chief Justice Roberts' own words, may the common sense and pragmatism of Justice Robert Jackson continue to prevail. Generous God, we ask also your continuing blessings upon all here present who have come today in celebration and gratitude for all that this center and gathering represent, as well as upon the lovely luncheon now to be presented to us. May all that is holy inspire and bless us all now and in the days and years to come. May it be so, and may we all, with renewed commitment to the good, proclaim with one grateful voice, Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain Ravigno. Of course, Maureen is a great friend of the Jackson Center, a supporter of the center, and as you can see, she is the Assistant Director for Religion at the Chautauqua Institution. So thank you again. Before I call forward our next speaker, who is, of course, the Honorable Richard J. Arcara, United States Judge for the United States District Court for the Western District of New York and former Chief Judge for that district, I would like to say that I did learn something about him this morning. And that is, now you're thinking about what you said to me this morning, aren't you? I can see it. But he is a fellow Army officer, a former MP in the United States Army, having served in Korea. And so again, that was wonderful to learn. And again, I ask you to come forward and welcome the Chief Judge, Chief Justice. Thank you.
I was in Korea after the war. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a very, very exciting day for all of us here. My name is Richard Arcara. I'm a district court judge in the Western District of New York, and I am pleased to be here at the Jackson Center, and I'm both honored and privileged to welcome to Western New York the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John G. Roberts, Jr. When I received a call from Greg Peterson asking if I would introduce the Chief Justice, I was delighted, and I accepted immediately. Throughout my career, I've had the good fortune of introducing a number of very, very distinguished individuals. I've introduced senators, I've introduced congressmen, I've introduced chief judges of the circuit courts, I've introduced circuit judges, I've introduced governors. I've had this opportunity. I have never had the opportunity of introducing a justice of the Supreme Court, much less the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I know that today is not only exciting for me, but also for the entire Western New York community. It was all over the radio this morning. It was all over television this morning, Chief Justice, that you were going to be here today. We are, as a district, are thrilled to have you here. An event honoring the life and the legacy of Justice Robert Jackson. As many of you may know, our new federal courthouse in Buffalo will be dedicated, well, it was dedicated about a year ago. And we could not be more pleased and proud than when last fall, President Obama signed legislation naming the new courthouse after Justice Robert H. Jackson. In preparing for today's remarks, I reviewed countless articles and papers about Chief Justice Roberts and all his significant achievements and accomplishments, which I could not possibly go through here today. I will mention just a few as I take you through a brief journey through the Chief Justice Roberts' life and legal career to date. To begin, I note that Chief Justice Roberts, one of his great accomplishments, which he had absolutely nothing to do with, was he was born in Buffalo, New York. Same city I was born in. Chief Justice Roberts was a plant manager with the Bethlehem Steel Company in Western New York. When he was in second grade, the Roberts family moved to Long Beach, Indiana, where his father continued his work in the steel industry. There, Chief Justice Roberts attended boarding school, excelling in both academics and sports, so much that he went on to college at Harvard. He graduated summa cum laude, earning a BA in history after just 3 years. During the summers, true to his blue-collar Western New York roots, he worked at a steel mill to help earn money for his tuition. After college, he began a law career in earnest by continuing his studies at Harvard Law School, graduating magna cum laude in 1979, where he was the managing editor of the Harvard Law Review. No small task. With such an impressive academic record, it's no surprise that Chief Justice Roberts' illustrious legal career had an impressive start. He spent his first year after law school clerking for the distinguished and scholarly Judge Henry Friendly of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Friendly is still widely regarded as a preeminent Court of Appeals judge of his era, and for that reason, Judge Friendly's decisions have been cited by many Supreme Court justices, including Chief Justice Roberts. While Judge Friendly is famous for having written his own opinions, one cannot help but wonder if Chief Justice Roberts didn't have at least a hand in writing to draft some of those most notable decisions, in which case he may very well be citing himself as for controlling his legal authority. I cite my own rulings as controlling legal authority too, but they somehow or other lack the legal significance of the Supreme Court of the United States. From 1980 to 1981, Chief Justice Roberts clerked for then Associate Justice William Rehnquist of the United States Supreme Court. This period of Chief Justice's biography is especially significant today, since the Jackson Center was dedicated 10 years ago yesterday on May 16, 2003, by former Chief Justice Rehnquist, Chief Justice Roberts' immediate predecessor and former mentor. It's an interesting parallel that the former Chief Justice Rehnquist served as a law clerk to Justice Jackson in his first job following law school. Following his clerkships, Chief Justice Roberts served as a special assistant to the United States Attorney General William French Smith. He then worked in the White House Counsel Office as Associate Counsel to President Ronald Reagan, the president that appointed me. For 4 years he worked there. In 1986, Chief Justice Roberts left government service to join the New York Times referred to as, and I quote, the blue chip Washington law firm of Hogan and Hartson. After 3 years in private practice, he left and he returned to government service as the Principal Deputy Solicitor General for President George H.W. Bush. In his role as Principal Deputy Solicitor, he argued many cases before the Supreme Court on behalf of the United States government. I would also note that Justice Jackson served as a Solicitor General from 1938 to 1940, demonstrating yet another parallel between the lives and legal career and paths of Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Jackson. In 1993, he returned to Hogan and Hartson as a partner, and there he spent the next 10 years as the head of the firm's appellate practice group. While most lawyers dream of arguing just one case before the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts argued 39 cases there, and by all accounts, his legal arguments were a model of excellence in appellate oral advocacy. Legal experts who study the Supreme Court and the attorneys who regularly appear there have called Chief Justice Roberts, quote, the best Supreme Court advocate of his generation, end of quote, and, quote, the gold standard, end of quote, to which lawyers aspire. I argued one case before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that certiorari was improvidently granted. In other words, I didn't do a very good job. Needless to say, I was quite nervous on that day. I think that Roger Parloff, a senior editor for CNN, who listened to all the tapes, the 39 arguments of Justice Roberts, put it best when he commented that the future Chief Justice Roberts, quote, seemed to anticipate every question and responded instantly in complete grammatical sentences, salted with down-to-earth analogies and occasionally wicked wit. End of quote. It was during his second stint at Hogan and Hartson that Chief Justice Roberts reconnected with Jane Sullivan, whom he had first met in 1991, who was a magna cum laude graduate from the College of Holy Cross. Jane earned her master's degree in applied math from Brown University and a law degree from Georgetown. She is presently the managing director of the Legal Recruiting Company. The Roberts married in 1996 at St. Patrick's, Washington, oldest Catholic cathedral, and they have 2 lovely children. In 2003, President George Bush appointed John Roberts to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. I will refrain from quoting the New York Times article, which mentions Chief Justice Roberts' law firm salary at the time he re-entered government service. He may want to mention it. But applied math tells us that he must have felt a very strong calling to return to public service. Some consider the D.C. Court of Appeals a stepping stone for appointment to the highest court in our land. Thus, it came as little surprise when just 2 years later, President George Bush nominated him to replace Chief Justice Rehnquist as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was sworn in September 29, 2005, as the 17th Chief Justice of the United States. At only 50 years of age, Chief Justice Roberts became the youngest Chief Justice since President John Adams appointed John Marshall to the seat in 1801. Since Chief Justice Roberts began his tenure as Chief, the Supreme Court has already tackled and will continue to tackle many legal issues such as health care reform, marriage equality, the proper parameters for excluding evidence in criminal cases, and First Amendment rights, among others. The outcomes of these cases will not only shape federal jurisprudence, but will also have a lasting impact on the lives of American citizens for generations to come. In preparing for today, I read that Chief Justice Roberts often spoke about his great admiration and respect for Justice Jackson. This seems fitting not only because we are privileged to have the Chief Justice here today, speaking at the center, which honors the life and the legacy of Justice Jackson, but also because of the many similarities between Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Jackson. Both are considered outstanding legal writers and scholars. Both rose to the highest levels of government service as both advocates and as judges. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you the Chief Justice of the United States, Chief Justice Roberts.
Judge O'Cara, thank you very much for that wonderful welcome for the Chief Justice. Please enjoy your meal. It is at this time, and I will say I will say very little to no introduction for John Barrett. But it is at this time I ask John Barrett to come forward. You all know who he is, and John, I think, has a few other little bits to give us this noon. From you may have kind of given us a little interest this morning, and I think he has a little more that he'd like to tell us. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Jim. No, it's not that bad.
No, it'll just be a lot shorter.
I need the better podium. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, friends. Mr. Chief Justice, thank you again for your presence here. I'm here in a Paul Harvey-like capacity. Now the rest of the story. You'll remember that I mentioned in my remarks this morning outside the sabotage case that became Robert Jackson's first big piece of litigation 100 years ago this month. And really, This is for Jamestown. There's a small display and description of this upstairs. But I think this episode is an interesting one. Alas, not a federal case, Your Honor, merely a state criminal prosecution, but something that really is formative in the Jackson story. And so I just wanted to walk you through the timeline with the headlines of the Jamestown newspapers. The Jamestown landscape of literature, if you will, at that time, as in many cities, was both a morning and an afternoon paper. I grew up in Milwaukee, and I was a paper boy for the Milwaukee Journal, an afternoon paper, and the Milwaukee Sentinel was the morning paper. And today's there's the Journal Sentinel, and it's less than it once was. Jamestown had the Morning Post, and it had the afternoon Jamestown Journal. And of course, today it has the Post Journal. In these days, the Morning Post was a Democratic paper, and the Jamestown Journal, the afternoon paper, was a Republican paper, if you will. Now, I might be oversimplifying, but there was a more pro-labor perspective in the morning paper and a more pro-streetcar company perspective in the afternoon paper. This strike that began in May of 1913, interestingly, having spun a lot of microfilm over at the Prendergast Library, is covered very little in the Morning Post. On the other hand, the afternoon Jamestown Journal has headlines just short of Pearl Harbor attack size. And that's the imbroglio, activity, vandalism, arrest, and criminal defense that becomes this Jackson case. And I wanted simply to share with you some of the Jamestown Journal, Jamestown Evening Journal afternoon paper headlines. It begins on May 1st. Strike was declared at early hour today, and it's just a little front page box. And then shortly thereafter comes 8 men arrested on very serious charges, which is the description of the vandalism. They did it not downtown where I think the policing was more of an issue. They went sort of up the lake and in the Lakewood area and so forth, where the traction lines and the trolley companies reached all the way up to Chautauqua, indeed to Mayville. That's where they chopped their poles and cut the wires and wedged the switches and so forth. The next day, 5 men confessed to damaging property on street railway lines. You can see the momentum of prosecution. Meanwhile, another wild night of riot in the streets of city on Monday. And then 3 nights of riot make strenuous work for police and sheriff. Perhaps the afternoon paper was also law enforcement's paper. And then soon grand jury convened in Mayville. And then indictments returned in grand jury at Mayville. And then an interesting box on the front page which says, Frank Mott appointed to position. You see, Frank Mott was the Jamestown lawyer who Jackson was apprenticing for. Frank Mott was a Democratic politico, represented the Labor Council, did all manner of litigation. And in that June 1913 period, a new Democratic governor in the state of New York, William Sulzer, nominates Mott to be the counsel to the State Public Service Commission. That's an Albany job, and that's what pulls Mott into the political orbit and out of the practice orbit. The arraignments are where Jackson makes his appearance. He does what every good lawyer, at least on the defense side, I think, knows to do: request an adjournment, a postponement, a delay. And so this June to July problem becomes a resumption at the next term of the court in September. And that's when Jackson, still not admitted to the bar, petitions for leave of court to be permitted to defend these attorneys. Now, why wasn't Jackson admitted to practice? He was 21. He had taken and passed the New York State bar exam earlier in 1913. The answer is that New York State required 3 years of law preparatory training before one could be admitted to the bar. Counterpart rules are in effect today, and most satisfy it in law school. Jackson, of course, had spent only 1 year in law school, and before that a year as an apprentice, and now was late in, but still in, a 2nd year as an apprentice. He needed to get to November to satisfy the 3-year clock, at which point his bar result and his 3-year duration would be the basis for his application, and indeed his admission in the 4th Department to practice. But he's 2 months before that. He asked Judge Ottaway, who's presiding at Mayville, to let him take over this defense. And the district attorney, a fellow named Green, readily consents. I said that in passing this morning. Jackson, late in life, ruminated about what joy the district attorney had, what alacrity with which the district attorney consented. You know, you want to be represented by a non-lawyer kid? By all means, the state has no objection. And so that is the granting of the motion, and then that's the commencement of the first trial. Jackson's client was actually a fellow named Gaynor. The cases were being tried in a serial fashion. And the DA presents his first four witnesses and then rests, at which point Jackson makes his motion under New York's penal law, which prohibited cases based on solely accomplice testimony. In other words, cooperators, people who had cut a deal, no independent witnesses. It's a cousin, perhaps a distant cousin, of the two-witness rule in the treason clause, literally in the Constitution. There's a sort of value of independence and absence of bias in evidence in our constitutional structure and in state laws, and that's what Jackson takes advantage of. The DA is flabbergasted by this motion, but recognizes that the charging document in the case he presented exactly fell into this legal bar of New York state law. And so he loses the motion, the directed verdict of acquittal is given, and then the DA null prosecutes virtually all of the other sabotage cases. So Jackson wins this one case, but in a sense it's the collapse of the entire prosecution of the strikers. And what's interesting is that one of the very impressed people is Mr. Broadhead, the chairman of the Jamestown Street Railway Company. Mr. Broadhead was a great businessman and also apparently not prone to generous wage increases. That was the genesis of the strike and all the legal trouble that ensued. And at the end of this process, I unfortunately don't know much about what happened to the strikers who became the defendants, but I do know that A.N. Broadhead became a Robert Jackson client. Jackson ended up doing corporate work for the Street Railway Company, estate work for the Broadhead family, and indeed sort of personal friends and relations were what developed there. And so it's an interesting glimpse of sort of starting small and working diligently and knowing your stuff and being ready, leading onward and upward to big things. And my connection, Mr. Chief Justice, as you grace us and honor us with your presence, is to the Jackson Center. The Jackson Center was an idea, maybe a harebrained idea is the way to describe it. I was getting started writing law review articles about Robert Jackson. That's who I'm talking about. And I called a gentleman, Harold Adams, now deceased, who I had located as a name in some Jackson materials and knew he was Jackson's surviving nephew. And I knew he was in Jamestown, New York. Some of you have heard me describe knowing that Jamestown was upstate, and I got out a New York State atlas, and I ran my finger up the Hudson River. I just could not find Jamestown. Kept getting to Canada and starting over, and then I located it out in Cleveland. So I called Harold Adams, and he was charming, and he told me memories of his uncle, Bob Jackson. And then he said, you know, there's a Jamestown lawyer you should talk to, Greg Peterson. He's interested in Jackson. He has an idea, Greg, I have the notes, of a Jackson Institute, was the phrase that Harold Adams used. And so I called Greg. That was late 2000. That was literally when the benefactors and the original fundraising was taking shape. And from that early moment, that youthful moment, that not yet admitted to anything, not yet qualified to do anything, moment of brilliance and vision and preparation over the ensuing 12 years has grown this center and this series of accomplishments, this testament to a great life, the teaching that we're all committed to, and the presence of the Chief Justice of the United States. Thank you, sir.
As the architect of that harebrained idea, let me take a few moments. I told Jim we were not going to really do this, but there's too much history in this room not to do this. So for some of those who, because of the way you were seated today during the Chief Justice's remarks, and we called out a few folks who are really historically significant in the life and times of Robert Jackson, I do want to pause and do so. We have right here Phil Neal. Phil Neal was the law clerk for Justice Robert Jackson, 1943-44 term. That's the Korematsu case, in case you're curious. That was that time period, and we're just absolutely thrilled that Phil and wife Linda could join us again. Last time they were here was 2002. And looking over here, I see my good friend Dale Robbins, and Dale and I will remember an incident that occurred in 2002 when we were having the law clerks pause and discuss their terms with Justice Jackson, when all of a sudden, boom, the transformer outside and smoke started billowing in. And Dale got on the phone to call the BPU and say, help, we don't know what has happened. We lost all our lights. Are we going to go up in smoke? That could have been the Robert Jackson Center second and only event. But long story short, we took a break and we regrouped, and we actually completed the C-SPAN moment in time. We also have, we're blessed to have, E. Barrett Prettyman Jr. E. Barrett Prettyman Jr. was the 1953-54 term of Robert Jackson, as well as Felix Frankfurter and John Marshall Harlan. So Barrett has many distinctions, one of them being the only man that we're aware of who actually worked with 3 Supreme Court justices. We learned last night that Barrett was very much a mentor to our special guest, Chief Justice Roberts, and the rest of his resume is so long we don't have time. Also, Father Moritz Fuchs, a story which should be a television story, because here's a private in the Army who, by circumstances, became the sole bodyguard of Robert Jackson at Nuremberg. And what's remarkable about this story, not only was he with him 24/7, but he saw day in and day out during the trial, the testimony that was gleaned through Justice Jackson's prosecuting and the prosecution team, the inhumanity to man. And to say there was a spiritual epiphany would be an understatement, but in fact, he shortly after leaving Nuremberg went into religion and became ordained, and now he's Father Moritz Fuchs. So it's just a thrill to have those connections here in our midst today, because I relish those moments, and I know as a history major, Chief Justice Roberts likewise, and I just want to say, so to them, I just pause and give them a hand. And speaking of history, and this is my introduction to bring up Congressman Brian Higgins. Congressman Higgins is in his 5th term. He represented our district for a period of time until most recently redistricting put him up in the Buffalo, Niagara County, or Erie and Niagara County areas. But Brian Higgins headmanned the process of the naming of the new federal courthouse in Buffalo. As we know, we have Chief Justice Roberts here, who's the head of the federal judiciary, and within that domain is, in fact, federal courthouses. And so on October 5th, 2012, President Obama signed legislation of which there's nobody who was more important than Congressman Higgins, who coupled with Judge Arcara and Judge Scretany really did some amazing things. So we're going to pause for a second and call up Congressman Brian Higgins.
How you doing?
I have to follow the Jackson Scholar. Chief Justice Roberts, that's cruel and unusual punishment. Let me also say that Congressman Tom Reed, who wanted to be here today, is a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and couldn't be here because they're dealing with a little IRS issue in Washington. But Tom truly wanted to be here and couldn't be because of those hearings. I'll be here again, even though I don't represent this area, tomorrow. Our oldest son, John, graduates from Fredonia State College tomorrow. And there's 2 commencements. I'm speaking at both of them. So I said, John, do you have any suggestions as to what I might want to talk about tomorrow? And he said, no, but it was just one of those responses where something else was on his mind. I said, well, do you have any advice? He said, keep it short. Before this congressional gig got my way, I was a teacher of history and economics at Buffalo State College. And when I was first elected to Congress in 2005, I met Greg Peterson and truly did not know anything about Justice Jackson. but I knew of the founding mission and the vision of those who founded this great center. And it was to impart not only knowledge about this extraordinary Western New Yorker, but curiosity about this extraordinary American. And what's often, I think, put aside is the extraordinary ability that Jackson had to communicate through the spoken word, but also the written word. And the law and words mean nothing unless they are spoken in a compelling way and with great eloquence. At the Nuremberg trial, Jackson was known to deliver the greatest English language courtroom speech in history. He always spoke with a great appreciation for both literature and history imbued with humor and optimism. His speeches reflected the greatest of that of the American tradition. He spoke in Nuremberg not only to the assembled tribunal, but to the world about the crimes against peace and about the law of individual responsibility. Lawrence Tribe, the great constitutional scholar, characterized Jackson as the most piercingly eloquent writer in the history of the United States Supreme Court. So today, this is quite an event. As Joe Biden would say, this is a big, no, I would. But you had 1,700 people here. I met kids, high school kids from the Nichols School in Buffalo, kids from Springville, kids from Orchard Park. And the greatest thing that you can do, it's not IQ, it's CQ. It's the curiosity quotient. And you instill an appreciation in all those kids for the extraordinary work that Judge Jackson did and the extraordinary place that he holds in the American legal tradition. But Greg, the Buffalo Courthouse would not have been named the Robert H. Jackson Federal Courthouse without you in the Jackson Center. There were a lot of people that thought it should be named for Wild Bill Donovan, an extraordinary, colorful, unique American from Western New York, and they made compelling arguments. But in the final analysis, after all the facts were gathered and analyzed and presented in the great tradition of Jackson, you won out. But this would not have been done without you. So I wanted to present to you personally a copy of the bill signed by President Barack Obama naming the new federal courthouse in Buffalo for Associate Justice Robert H. Jackson. There you go, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Greg, you don't get to take that home. That stays here at the center, okay? Okay, before I introduce our chairman of the board, David Crane, for a few closing remarks, I'd just like to comment on something the congressman said. And you mentioned about talking to the students from Orchard Park and Springville and elsewhere. First and foremost, our objective this morning was to bring this event to as many schools and students as we possibly could, to make this an educational event for the students and to make it a part of history for the students and something that they could remember for a long time and know that they were a part of. And I think that we were successful in doing that. And we were successful in doing that because of you, Chief Justice. And I want to thank you very, very much for allowing us to bring this educational opportunity to the students of the region. As the congressman said, we had students from Buffalo, as far away from Buffalo and farther. We had students sitting on a bus for probably an hour and a half to 2 hours, leaving the school at 7 o'clock this morning to get here. And we were able to bring that opportunity to the schools and students of the region because of you. And again, I want to thank you very, very much for that. I would now like to introduce Professor David Crane, the chairman of our board, for a few closing remarks. Thank you.
You know, as I was sitting on that veranda today, listening to the birds try to out-talk the Chief Justice, I was humbled. Not just humbled by, of course, our esteemed guest, but just humbled by what it means to be an American in this free country. Just sitting out, listening to one of our senior leaders talk about what he does, talk about the law, in a quiet, pleasant place with the breeze blowing. The importance also of the rule of law that makes this happen in a free society. And you know, rarely do we have a chance to reflect just that. All the good things that we have because of this nation, the cornerstone being the rule of law. So I know I'm supposed to just say thank yous. I mean, as you're probably saying, this guy doesn't do very much. He gives toasts and says thank yous. But I don't mind. I'm pretty good at it. But I do want to thank a few people before we close this momentous 24 hours. I'd like to thank, obviously, Greg Peterson, who I met in 2005 in September. I was sitting at my office, my new office. I had just started as a professor, having come from West Africa. And I get this call. My secretary goes, "There's a guy named Greg Peterson from Jamestown." I said, "I don't know Greg Peterson, but I'll take it." And so I pick up the phone. He goes, "You don't know me." Well, here I am. So let's give a big hand to just Greg Peterson for his vision. And of course, all around the room, interspersed are my colleagues, the members of the board, who labor quietly behind the scenes. They give their time, they give their financial support, and they just give their good graces. So for the board members that are here, if you just please stand, I'd like just to recognize you. One person I'd like to just single out because I think this is probably her last day, and that's Carol Drake, who is one of the originals of the originals and actually is the person who runs this wonderful place. So Carol, I would just like to, if you're here, usually Carol's off doing something. She's off doing something. Well, there she comes, down the stairs. Carol Drake is retiring. I want to give her a special recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, the person who owns Jackson Center. For those of us who have managed large and small organizations and branches of government, it's the people that make that organization, that law firm, that branch of government. I always learned when I was a lieutenant in the 101st Airborne Division, you take care of your people, and your people will take care of you, and by golly, we all know that. And really, we just wanted to especially recognize Carol, but also there's a team at the Jackson Center. We have a new president and CEO, our first actually president and CEO, Jim Johnson, a colleague and friend of mine of over 30 years. We were special operators once together. We were much younger and better looking. I personally recruited Jim to be head of the task force that prosecuted Hinga Norman in Sierra Leone for horrific crimes, which he did magnificently. And then I moved on and Jim stepped up to be head of those various trial teams. We call them the chief of prosecutions, which he remained there for, he was the longest serving member of my original office of 10 years in Sierra Leone seeking justice for the people of Sierra Leone. And now I called him up once and said, "Look, Jim, I think I've got a job for you." And he says, "You know, I think I might like to do that." So Jim, welcome and thank you for what you did throughout all of this week as well. So Jim Johnson. Then, of course, lastly, we have the rest of the wonderful staff. Deborah Pecos, who is our Director of Communications. Jen, are you here as well? Jen is off doing what Jen does, our archivist. If you've gone up and seen Making the Movement and other exhibits, these are the wonderful people that make the Jackson Center run as well. So thank you for also what you did today. So. And also the interns who labor quietly and moved us about and told us to stand here and take this and don't do that and don't take that picture, et cetera, et cetera. Again, let's give them a big hand. And lastly, the Chief Justice, we all have moments in our lives. We all note historic moments. I would just like to say, Mr. Chief Justice, just thank you for the moment. It's been deeply appreciated, and we wish you all the best in your tenure. And remember, the Jackson Center is here, and come back if you would, please. Thank you. I believe that concludes the ceremonies, and thank you all for coming. Oh, the benediction. Father Fuchs, if you'd come up and finish this properly. Thank you, sir.
Let us pray. Oh God, we stand humbly in your presence among the beauties of your creation in springtime. We came here to acknowledge Chief Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court of the United States as he honors us in our memory and recognition of this center dedicated to honor Robert Jackson. Bless our efforts as we honor the memory of Mr. Jackson in this complex that fosters our learning more and working together more to promote our living by the rule of law. We cherish, Almighty God, your extravagant blessings that over the years have enabled the development of our great nation. I'd ask you to stand now, if you would, please, for the remainder. We ask you to bless our leaders today and bless all of us, because we want to be a people who can welcome worldwide assurance that we truly are living as one nation under God. It's really today is a kind of Norman Rockwell moment, so things work out so beautifully. Our thoughts remain mere words until they gain expression. Our unity can only arise from respecting each other in our diversity. Those are ways we can also show that we are, as a nation, respecting God. In God we trust is our national motto. Can we do that trusting in our daily lives? Do we ever say it as well as think it? Can we say it now, together, aloud? In God we trust? In God we trust. Thank you. With a similar uplifting spirit, let's join hands now. We all are on our table, and pray together our gratitude to God for us being one nation under God. Let's say it using the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen.
Hope I got some of those dates right.